And it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this Global Innovation Index event in New York. We had the main launch in Geneva last Monday. It was an exceptional launch with the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself launching the report as part of the ECOSOC high-level segment meeting in Geneva. And now 1 week later, we are having a follow-on discussion event around the Global Innovation Index. And I'm very pleased that we have with us today a panel of 6 very distinguished leaders from a variety of different fields. I will just read the names. Their bios are very extensive, so it'll take me a long time to go through them, so please look to the bios in this program outline that is there on your table. So on my left, we have David Skorton, the president of Cornell University. We have Bob Kahn, who's the chairman, CEO, and president for the Corporation of Natural Research Initiatives. We have Barry Zarulski, who is the senior partner at Booz & Company. And then on my right, we have Francis Gurry, the Director General for the World Intellectual Property Organization. Then we have Teresa Ria, who is the Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and the Acting Director of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And we have Dan Huttenlocher, who is the Dean and Vice Provost for Cornell New York Tech. Now, collectively, I'm sure you'll agree that we could not have hoped for a better panel to discuss issues around innovation, especially focused on the local dynamics of innovation. So with those few introductory words, I hand over to David Skorton for his few words of welcome.
Thank you, Dean Dutta. As you know, university presidents are not capable of saying just a few words about anything. But, so settle in, enjoy your coffee. For those of you who don't work so much in the higher education world, this is an example of the hierarchy. Dean Dutta last week was in Geneva, Switzerland, not Geneva, New York, launching this with the Secretary General of the United Nations. And I was at home working on the garden in Ithaca, New York. So it is true that counting the dean, there are 6 distinguished people on the panel, and we're thrilled to have you here today. And first I want to congratulate Soumitra for the tremendous work that he's done, and Mr. Gurry and others. Very, very important. I'm especially interested and gratified that the theme this year has to do with local, or if I can extrapolate a little bit, regional innovation. That's a big topic worldwide, and for those of you who don't follow some of the things that are happening in this regard in the city of New York, the state of New York, both the city and the state have pushed in a very effective way, in my estimation, into this field of local and regional innovation. In fact, in our country, in the United States of America, many of the most innovative approaches to this area are in fact being done at the municipal or state or regional level. And therefore I think it's especially fitting that this is a sub-theme of this, I believe, the 6th time that this index has been introduced. To give you just a quick rundown on what's happening in that regard in New York. In New York City, the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development, Robert Steele, and the President of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, Seth Pinsky, and Mayor Bloomberg, about 2.5 years ago, introduced a competition for an applied sciences initiative. You're going to hear more about that from the person who directed the application that eventually won, Dean and Vice Provost Dan Huttenlocher, whom Dean Dutta recently introduced. And you'll hear more about that, so I won't burden you with redundancies, except to say that that's another example of regional innovation, in this case, the city of New York. And in that particular case, the leaders in the city who developed the request for expressions of interest and then request for proposals recognized a talent gap in the graduate disciplines related to the tech world and you'll hear more about that. So that's one way in which higher education and regional innovation came together. The governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, in the last legislative session, along with the legislature, introduced a whole variety of different regional economic development initiatives, one of which I think is particularly relevant today, something called Startup New York, in which in the upstate region, and selectively in other areas, but largely in the upstate region, has introduced very significant and very creative tax abatements for companies that develop related to college or university intellectual property. And when I say creative tax abatements, I mean, for example, no New York State income tax for a decade for employees of startup companies or expansion companies that fit the criteria. And tax abatements are one of the tools that are used a lot in regional competitions for attraction and retaining of companies. This is a bridge farther, at least in my experience, and so there's an example of the state. And also has developed a competition for what the legislature and the governor are calling innovation hotspots. And in these areas, there'll be competitive applications to develop regional incubators around the state. To be a little more parochial, I'll tell you a tiny bit about regionalism within Cornell University. Just about to celebrate our sesquicentennial, and we are all over the world, literally. But there's 5 main campuses in which Cornell does its day-to-day activities, and I just want to remind you what they are because they themselves are an example of regional innovation. The main campus is in Ithaca, New York, where we have 22,000 students and over 5 startup companies per year out of that campus. Here in New York City for 100 years, Weill Cornell Medical College, which also has at least a couple, 3 startup companies basically every single year. Thirdly, the Cornell Tech campus, which you'll hear more about later, a campus specifically created to develop the linkage between graduate education in the tech disciplines and societal good. A very exciting project you'll hear about from one of the people who created the concepts that won that competition. And also a different Geneva, New York. Cornell has a long-standing agriculture experiment station. And as you're aware, and I think it's particularly relevant, Soumitra, in a worldwide event like this, in most parts of the world, agriculture still looms as a huge employment factor. In the United States, something like 2% of the population work in agriculture. But even then, in upstate New York, it's one of the main industries. And although it may sound a little facetious, upstate New York, with a lot of linkage to the Cornell University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, is experiencing a boom in the production and distribution of yogurt, which is turning out to be a very large growth industry. So if you go to the store and you buy Chobani or Faya yogurt, it's not produced in a little whitewashed village spilling down to the Aegean. It's in a little whitewashed area in upstate New York. And Chobani alone is over $1 billion operation. And the Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences is very, very much involved in all kinds of interactions with the companies and also training folks who deal with food processing around the entire state of New York. So whether we're talking about the city of New York or the state of New York or even in a much smaller scale, Cornell University, people are voting with their feet to follow this area of local and regional innovation. So very, very excited to get on with the real business today. Honored to be here. And I want to thank you and congratulate you again, Soumitra, for all that you've gotten done. Congratulations.
Thank you, David. You're providing great leadership to Cornell, and I think we all are grateful for that. Now I hand over to Francis for his comments.
Thank you very much, Soumitra. Ladies and gentlemen, President Skorton, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. Let me start by saying something about WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, because I'm sure many of you are not very familiar with it at all. We are an intergovernmental organization based in Geneva with 187 member states. We're a specialized agency of the United Nations. We deal with the promotion of intellectual property, and we do that in four principal ways, which very briefly are that we run a number of systems that make it easier to get intellectual property protection around the world. For example, we have over 200,000 international patent applications filed with us each year. We are involved, secondly, in the development of the international legal framework for the protection of intellectual property around the world. Last week, we concluded a new treaty in this respect in the copyright area to facilitate access to published works for visually impaired persons. We have various projects in the area of infrastructure, virtual infrastructure, databases, linking offices, and finally we have a large program for the development of the capacity of the developing countries to participate more and to use in a better way the intellectual property system. Why have we become involved in this little venture, which is becoming rapidly a very big venture, the Global Innovation Index? Because, of course, the reason why we have intellectual property is innovation. That is the purpose for which we go through the process of intellectual property. This is the social and economic outcome that we wish to achieve. And of course, innovation, economically, we know, is the major component of economic growth. It is increasingly the key to economic success, by the way, military success. It is the basis increasingly in an economy which is based more and more on intangibles. It's the basis of competition amongst enterprises. And what intellectual property does, of course, is to capture the economic value of innovation, and that is why we have seen phenomena such as, for example, the patent wars, which are really competition being played out in respect of intangibles and intellectual property. Innovation, of course, is also the way in which we address as society our major social challenges. You know, in a heavily populated, highly urbanized world of 10 billion people, we will have to increase our productivity in agriculture by around 70%, just to take one field that was mentioned by President Skorton. And the way in which we will do that, of course, will be through innovation. And it's likewise for the challenges that we face as a society with respect to health, or the challenges that we face in overcoming climate change. We will do this eventually principally through innovation and the economy adapting to the fruits of innovation. This is why we have been involved in the Global Innovation Index. The capacity to innovate is, of course, not evenly shared around the world, but unlike physical resources, which a country either has or does not have as a permanent feature of its existence, the capacity to innovate can be acquired. And this is the value, we think, of the Global Innovation Index, since it sets out a methodology or a blueprint of the inputs to innovation and the outputs, which can serve as a benchmark for countries and policymakers in both the public and private sector who are interested in improving their innovation performance. We're delighted to have been able to cooperate with INSEAD and with Cornell University in the production of this. Let me acknowledge the special role of Soumitra Dutta, who has been a pioneer, of course, for the Global Innovation Index. Let me thank our knowledge partners, also Booz and Company, Du, Huawei, and the Confederation of Indian Industry for all of their support in putting together this Global Innovation Index. And we look forward to, I look forward to a very interesting morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, and I'm grateful to you and to WIPO for the collaboration. I must say that when we entered the partnership with WIPO, it really raised the profile of the Global Innovation Index and really put it at the center of the agenda of many nations around the world. So thank you very much. We look forward to a very bright future collaboration in the future. Now, before we enter into the main part of the panel discussion, I will take a few minutes to just walk through some high-level overview of the Global Innovation Index research. On your tables, you have some copies of the report. If you need some physical paper copies, please let us know. We'll try and get you one. And you can also download the report completely free online at a very simple URL, which is globalinnovationindex.org. Now, maybe I'll begin with a few slides. So while the projector goes alive, let me give you a sense of where the project started. So the project started around 6 years ago. And it started with a very simple realization that there was a lot of innovation happening in emerging markets around the world, which were not getting fully captured in traditional metrics like patents and publications and other kinds of PhD or very science and technology oriented metrics. Now, we realized that this is something which perhaps could be worked on, and especially as we work with many emerging markets, people told us there's a lot of innovation happening in our markets, but somehow that's not being recognized. And besides the economic and social well-being, which is very important impacts of innovation, there is a very fundamental human reason why innovation is very important. It is just simply a very key way to inspire young people. You know, what you see happening in America to a large degree, and what you see also happening in many other emerging markets, is young people today are inspired to create, to give voice to their own leadership and to their own potential. And innovation is very important for that. Next slide, please. Now, as was mentioned by Francis, this has been and has evolved over the last few years into a really collaborative global project. So there are three major publishers: Cornell, INSEAD, and WIPO. Then we have 4 partners in the private sector. You have Booz, CII from India, Huawei, and DEW. DEW is a telecom company in the Middle East. And then we have other partners like the European Commission, the Joint Research Center, that really provides a very independent statistical audit of the results. And of course, we have an international advisory board. The members of the board are listed in the report, and they include luminaries like the heads of UNESCO, ITU, CERN, and many other organizations. The next slide, please. Now, I know you cannot read this, so let me just give you a sense of what the underlying model of innovation in the Global Innovation Index is. So there is an index result produced, but underlying that, there is a sense that an economy has to work on multiple enabling conditions. So an economy needs some foundations on which to create innovative activities, and an economy also needs to demonstrate successful results of innovation. So we call these pillars, so there are 5 input pillars which are necessary for an economy to invest in, to support innovation. They are around institutions, human capital and research, infrastructure, market sophistication, and business sophistication, composed of further sub-pillars. I will not go into details right now. These 5 input pillars average out to produce a score for the input conditions, so what we call the input index. There are 2 output pillars, one focused on the more traditional science and technology indicators, so what we call the knowledge and technology outputs. And what is perhaps a little bit less traditional is we also have another output pillar of creative outputs, focusing on the creative sector. And 2 years ago, we also introduced, for example, this whole focus on citizen innovation, because today individuals are innovating online in various kinds, and we have to try and capture some of this individual creativity happening in society around us. So those 2 pillars in the output create an innovation output sub-index score. An average of that gives the overall Global Innovation Index score. And what is also interesting is we have a ratio of output by input. And that gives an innovation efficiency ratio score. And the 2 are not the same, but at the same time, they provide different interesting perspectives out here. Next slide, please. So let me just walk through 4 key results that I would like to share with you. The first one is innovation today clearly has become a global game. Now, if you look at how we define it, one way to look at it is the rankings, and the rankings, of course, gets a lot of visibility in the press. From an academic perspective, is probably not the most exciting part, but nevertheless, if you look at the rankings, you see countries from across the globe. You see countries from Europe, from America, you see countries from Asia, and if you just go a little bit beyond the top 10, you also see countries from Middle East. Israel is ranked number 14, doesn't show up out here in the list of the top 10. So the GII score on the rightmost column out here is the overall average of input and output. The interesting element also is the efficiency ratio, which is output by input. And that you see some countries which are not traditionally thought of as being, let's say, the usual suspects in the range of innovation and countries discussions. So here you see countries that for some reasons are showing a very high ratio conversion from the inputs to outputs, and there is some element of independence in terms of how these scores correlate with the income levels. So there's an interesting dimension you can actually analyze out there, and the various cuts you can take on the data out here. Now, if you look at the countries by income groups or by regions, you get another classification. Again, I'm not completely sure you can read all this from back there, but in the online report and also in the paper report, you have a number of different ways you can cut and slice the data. Now, the second point is, despite there being a global element to innovation today, what we find is there is a divide across nations. So if you go to the next slide, what you see is these various, let's say, lines in the spider chart demonstrate that innovation results today still remain fairly highly correlated with income levels. The rich countries do dominate the space, and the difference between the richer high-income economies and the lower-income economies is fairly significant. So on the whole, there is a divide, and this divide is pretty consistent. In the last 3 years, what we see is, if you compare the last year and this year, the top 25 nations remain the same. There's some shifting of positions inside the 25, but really there is no new entrant in that top 25 nations. Now the next slide is that, having said this, the tool like the Innovation Index does provide a useful benchmarking tool. Now, in the report, you have fairly detailed country pages that list the actual scores and the various different relative ranks of the countries on the various indicators. So if you are a country X, if you're interested in country X, you can go and look at the details of performance of the country along different dimensions. And what is interesting is that this gives you some kind of a neutral basis for comparing yourself to others, maybe in the same region, or maybe in the same income group, or maybe in some competitive set which is of interest to you. So there is at least some kind of a conceptual basis to compare yourself with against other countries in this sector of innovation. And overall, what we have seen is a benchmarking tool like this does generate the basis for discussions. They don't necessarily show you all the results and all the correct actions, but they generate discussions, and they can help provide support for more specific actions and policies which might be relevant in a specific context. Now, interestingly, as we look at this comparison across countries, we do observe that not all countries perform the same at some income level. Some countries do outperform. So this is another slide that you can't necessarily read, but you get a sense out here. If you plot the Global Innovation Index scores by the GDP per capita on the x-axis, you start seeing that some countries are in fact on the trend line, some are below the trend line, but interestingly, some are above the trend line. So if you look at these different groupings, and you look at this group out here, which is a set of countries above the trend line, you see that there are about 18 countries, based on the data that we have in this report, who are outperforming their peers relative to the same income levels. So these countries in this case are Moldova, China, India, Uganda, Armenia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Jordan, Mongolia, Mali, Kenya, Senegal, Hungary, Georgia, and so on. Now, these are the countries that are in fact rising. Learners, not the leaders. There are leaders like the US and Switzerland which are leading and outperforming, but there is a second group of countries which are emerging fairly rapidly. And what is interesting to see is that some of these countries in fact moving quite rapidly. China, for example, was classified as a lower middle income country till about 3 years ago. It was ranked number 1 in that list. The classification changed to an upper lower middle income country, and in that group now it is ranked number 3, just behind Malaysia and Latvia. So it is in fact moving, and in fact China is doing extremely well on the knowledge and technology outputs indicators. Now, the last comment that I would make is around quality of innovation. So every year we keep evolving and trying to refine the metrics and make them more relevant and more pertinent. And a lot of this is based on discussions and feedback we get from meetings like this. And what we have tried to do this year is bring in some element of quality of innovation, not just quantity. So this year in particular, we have, for example, 3 indicators, and the 3 indicators are the quality of the universities. What are the top universities? How are they ranked? Second, if you look at the patents, are those patents filed in multiple countries? Because typically, if they're filed in multiple countries, there's one indication of whether they are more valuable than others. And in terms of citations of articles. So how often are articles cited by others? So we have some indicators of measures like this that focus on more on quality. And of course, you see out here on the top, you can't read it once again, I'm sorry about that, but you see USA, UK, Germany, Japan, Switzerland, France, Canada, Sweden being the top leaders on just those 3 metrics among the high-income economies. But what is also interesting is if you look at the middle-income economies, the top countries out there are China, Brazil, Russia, India, Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, Malaysia, and Chile, and Turkey. So you start getting a sense that even inside the income group, which countries are perhaps doing better than others. So again, this is a global competitive race, and you start getting a better feeling for how the world is evolving in this global dimension. This is my last slide, and really in some sense, you can raise a number of implications from the rich data that is there in the report. We really believe that the Innovation Index report today comprises probably the best database that we have of innovation-related factors in the world for more than 140 countries around the world. Now, having said this, there are a number of important policy implications that arise. Some of them are listed out here. So what we see is when we discuss about innovation with different economies or different regions, we see that its mindset is a very important issue. So it's extremely important to have innovation as a part of the mindset of leaders in the public and policy, public and private sectors of the region or country. If the mindset is not there, you're unable to actually act on the multiple different factors required to move the country up on the various factors for innovation. Metrics are very useful to bring everyone on the same page. Often people have very incomplete or subjective perceptions sometimes of how they perceive, or how they're doing, or how the country is doing, the region is doing. So metrics are not perfect. They have their own faults. But having said this, they're useful for having a debate on the same level playing field. And then you can use that to drive your own conclusions or your own actions in your own specific regions. Now, the core ingredient behind innovation is talent. This comes up repeatedly. Talent and human capital becomes the most important element driving innovation. And one of the key challenges for organizations and for countries today is how do you in fact build, attract, develop, retain talent in the best possible manner. And finally, I think what we see out here is the GII is a work in progress. As I said at the start, it's a very useful tool for enabling a discussion, for starting some kind of an engagement process with leaders from both the public and private sectors to help move the agenda for discussion around innovation forward. And we do certainly hope that by meetings such as this and other meetings that we organize in other parts of the world, we can really prove the value of having such discussion on innovation and ultimately help move the agenda of innovation forward. And let's keep in mind why. Of course, economic well-being, but also social well-being, and very important, to inspire young people. Inspiration is success of the future. So let me end with that, and I hope it gives you at least an overview of what is there behind the report. If you're interested, I encourage you to go and look at the report in more detail. And perhaps with that, I would like to move to the panel discussion. And I'd like to invite our panel members who haven't shared the views with us so far to just give us maybe 4 or 5 minute views in terms of what do they find are some of the most interesting questions on innovation on their mind today. So let's begin with you, Bob.
All right, I guess I up there. Traditions. This way people can see me in the back when I speak as well. You know, if this were the Royal Society, they would normally appoint a rapporteur to comment on the previous discussion, and the charge to the rapporteur is always to rip them to shreds. This is not the Royal Society, and I am not about to rip this report to shreds. In fact, I want to say that I think it's really an important contribution to be able to start to think about this issue of innovation from a quantitative point of view, and with real numbers and real metrics. So I congratulate you, all of you who've been involved in this report, for doing that. I spent a big part of my life dealing with innovation and the results of innovation. And you know, for about 13 years, I ran a part of the Defense Department called DARPA, where we invested in today's dollars probably something between $1.5 and $2 billion a year in what I would call early stage research. And let me just say a little bit about what that process is, because that's the mindset I bring to all of this, and I think it might be helpful for everybody here to have a sense of that. People would send us proposals of various kinds. They could be a $100,000 proposal or a $30 million proposal. But whatever the nature of the proposal, the first thing that we would do is look at it and see, is there an idea here? Is there a pony in the stack somewhere? And if the answer, and this takes a certain amount of talent to be able to see an idea, because it may not be written well, but the question really is there something here worth pursuing? If there is, then the question is, do we think it's feasible? That is, could the person who's actually proposing this idea actually make it happen? Is it actually doable, or is this a pie in the sky kind of idea, interesting to think about but not really doable in practice? If it's feasible, then the next question we would ask is, what difference would it make if it succeeded? That is, what is the impact of the work? And from a defense context, you sort of try to map it into something that could be of benefit to the Defense Department. But if you think about basic research in the Defense Department, there's almost nothing that the DoD funds that can't have the same, almost same equivalent use in the private sector. So this is a societal kind of evaluation that you make. What's the difference if it could happen? The one thing we did not ask ourselves is anything about GDP, economic growth, that sort of thing, because we were trying to invest for the benefit of the DoD and the country in that sense. And the final question is, if it passed all three of those tests, was there an actual plan that was written down? Did the PI have the capability of carrying out this work? Was this realistic? So this was the mindset that we brought into it, and it's a fundamental part of anything else that would go on leading to GDP growth, but it did not explicitly deal with that issue. And that's a very separate issue I want to come back to in a minute or so. Then there was a question of timing. Oftentimes we would get proposals from people who would want to work on an area that was a really good area, and you could go through that litany, but they were too late because other people had been there before them. So what's a good example? In the early 1980s, I don't know, or maybe late 70s, I don't know how many proposals came in for people who wanted to figure out how to get lots of microcomputers to work together, you know, to do a job more efficiently or faster. And you know, the first one that came in, we funded, but by the time we got around to the third or the fourth, the message back was, I'm sorry, we're already exploring that. Here are the groups that are working on it. Come in with some idea that's a little more innovative than just that basic statement. So timing was really important. then I want to point out the issue I mentioned a little earlier about the difference between investing in infrastructure and investing in kind of, well, let me just say, product kinds of ideas that are kind of one-off. Infrastructure being things that would affect almost everybody, and where things have to work together, whereas a single product is something you can do in your lab, and it's a one of your lab kind of creativity. I think those are very, very different kinds of investments. I'll just refer you to a talk I gave at the National Academy a number of years ago. It was on the internet, and it was to a group of people there who were involved in, I think, what was either the Westinghouse talent search or the Intel talent search. I forget who was funding it at the time. And so these were like 1,000 of the brightest young people in the country, and they had reached the finals of this talent search. And this young lady who was the spokesperson for the group, very articulate, got up at the end of the session and she said, you know, she wanted to thank me for all we had done to help create the internet, but she said, we have one fundamental question we really would like to understand better. What's that? She says, how did you manage to convince the governments of the world to let you build the internet? Now, I thought that was a very interesting question for a young person to ask, because they had an ordered notion of the world, and if you're going to do this, obviously, you should get everybody to buy in. And I said, you know, it's a very good question, but you're not going to like my answer. And I said, the reality is that when we started this work, nobody thought it was a good idea. And therefore, they figured, well, just let them have fun, and nothing much will come of it. And that's a very hard notion for people to gather, because when you look at something that's been so successful, you think, it must have been a straightforward goal from getting from here to there. But nothing that really can have a big impact can be that obvious early on, or somebody else would have done it. You really have to have the convictions of, you know, in your mind that you know what you're thinking about is really worthwhile and important to do. And then I want to close with by raising a question, really. In addition to having good metrics on innovation, I want to raise the question about the difference between creativity and innovation. Oftentimes these words are bandied about as if they're the same thing. I happen to be married to a lady sitting over here who's a copyright lawyer, and so I understand the difference between what goes on in the copyright world and the patent world. And creativity and originality often go together. Innovation often is more tied into the patent world, as I see it. And so it seems to me that there is some kind of a difference between somebody who's really creative, comes up with all kinds of new and interesting things, but it doesn't necessarily lead to something, and an innovation, which I presume you think about as leading to something. Now, I suspect there are people in this room who would say, no, they're really exactly the same thing. I just pose it as a question. Are creativity and innovation really the same thing? And if they are different, in what sense are they different? How do we measure or deal with the difference between those two things? So I just want to congratulate you on this study you're doing. I think it's a really important first step. But like anything else, I think there's much more work to do beyond it, and I hope you proceed to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And yesterday over dinner, Bob was just recounting how he just met the Queen of England, and he was awarded a very important prize for, amongst others, I think the biggest invention, the most important invention in the last 100 years, right? So, congratulations, Bob, and thank you for joining us. So, Thierry, we'd like to maybe hear your remarks.
It's best if I stand. Even I can stay awake better this way. At any rate, I do agree with everything that's been discussed so far. I have to tell you that my role, I'm with the U.S. government, so we have a slightly different perspective. I am the acting Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and the acting director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And yes, our primary job is to grant patents and issue trademarks. But it goes beyond that, because we actually advise the administration and the White House on all matters of intellectual property, including copyrights, even though we're not the Copyright Office. The Copyright Office is under the Library of Congress, which is under Congress, which is an entirely different branch of government. However, when we advise the government, we collaborate with a number of agencies, including the Copyright Office, Department of Justice, sometimes the FDA, sometimes NIST. So we actually work with a lot of other agencies. Now, one thing with the US government is, fortunately, our forefathers had great long-term vision, which is what we need when we innovate, right? And in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the US Constitution, patents and copyrights were recognized from the very beginning, and they decided that that's what would make our country great. So they wanted us to innovate. In my opinion, they also did not want to pay royalties back to England. And so, nobody says that part, but I think that's why you want a strong, so they wanted people, our motley country, when it was first created and it was not well organized, they wanted us to innovate. And I think that that early appreciation for innovation helped make our country, our very diverse country, as great as we are today. So when it comes to innovation, I guess I just wanted to give you 2 points right now. Right now, I do think the government should fund very basic research that may look useless, or we may not appreciate where it's going long term, but it's somehow that data and that information will help us, and new technologies will arise, new things will help us, whether it's in healthcare, a higher quality of life, an even better cell phone, better ways of getting our content and information, and making our lives in general easier. And I can't even foresee those possibilities right now, because it's amazing how some of these very creative thinkers are looking, what are we going to want in the year 2020 and 2030, and they're already thinking that far down the road, which is far beyond me. We get cutting edge patent applications at the US Patent and Trademark Office, but that's for technology that has already been made to work. It's already useful. Those far off technologies are not something I yet appreciate. But I think government should still fund, for instance, the basic NIH research. They still do basic cell research without any purpose in mind. They don't know if it'll help cure cancer or prevent infection. They have no idea if this will lead to a new class of antibiotics with a new awareness, new information about just the basic cell, what we're always taught about in biology. But I think funding that basic NIH research is critical to further research. Now, it doesn't do us any good to have that technology sit there, whether it's in a university environment or in a government-sponsored type project or at NIH or at a Scripps Research or something. So what we do is we have legislation in the US called Bayh-Dole that allows that information to be licensed to an outside company, almost the ideal or first public-private partnership, to allow that idea to actually be put in the hands of individuals who could best develop a commercial product and commercialize it. So that's number one. We don't want the technology to sit. And number two, the only other point I want to leave you with, and I am from the US Patent and Trademark Office, it's that we want to encourage people to innovate. And nobody will spend the time or the money on cutting edge research, giving us the tools, the new medications, the new toys, the new electronics on cars, and it'll make my husband happy once we get a completely drivable car, because he thinks my driving isn't that good. Having been in one of those cars, I still think my driving at this moment is still a little bit better. Changing lanes is exciting. But at any rate, I do think that we need intellectual property. We need a strong intellectual property system that for a limited number of years, and right now the basic international standard for patent law is 20 years from the filing date, is to actually protect that innovation in the sense that whoever spent that time and money to make that discovery, they would have a period of exclusivity to recoup their research and then inevitably put that money into yet more research to improve the lives of everyone in society. So at any rate, you may think this is a little bit of an advertisement, but I do think that intellectual property globally and the protection of intellectual property is something that actually serves our global society very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry, for your comments. Dan?
So as President Skorton said at the beginning, I'm Dan Huttenlocher. I'm the dean of our new campus, Cornell's new campus here in New York City, Cornell Tech. And I thought I'd say a few words just about Cornell Tech since it's new before talking a little bit about innovation more broadly. So Cornell Tech grew out of a competition that the Bloomberg administration held starting in late 2010, and they announced a winner in late 2011. It was a global competition to attract the university to New York City to help drive the technology ecosystem here in New York. The Bloomberg administration recognized that technology innovation was incredibly important, and that New York City, compared to other major urban centers in the United States at least, was well behind on the technology innovation, particularly the relationship between universities and the kind of role that they played in a successful technology ecosystem. So Cornell, together with our academic partner, the Technion, the Israeli Institute of Technology, won that competition, and we've just started putting our new campus together. It's still 4 years from now, summer of 2017, we will move to our permanent location out in the middle of the East River on Roosevelt Island. That will be an approximately 12-acre campus, and when it's fully built out, which is still a quarter century from now, it will be about 2 million square feet, 2,000 students, and over 200 faculty members. One of the very innovative things about the physical plant is that that campus will not just be academic space, it will also be corporate innovation space. So it will be a mix of academic and corporate innovation kinds of activities. And that's really something that infuses all of the programmatic aspects of the campus. We're not waiting for 2017 to start this campus. In fact, we started in January, in the middle of the school year, this past year, so about 6 months ago now, in space that was very nicely donated to us by Google. So for the first 5 years, we're operating out of Google's New York City headquarters building down in Chelsea. We started with about 10 students and 2 faculty members in January, about 2/3 of those students in a computer science master's program, and the others were PhD students. By this coming fall, so in another 6 or 8 weeks from now, we'll be up to about 8 faculty and about 35 students. We're really growing at the rate of a startup company, so the N is still small, but the growth rate is very fast. We expect to be hundreds of students and tens of faculty before we even move to Roosevelt Island another 4 years from now. The campus is focused on technology, and particularly the technologies of the digital age, because those are so crucial to New York City. And really our fundamental goal on this new campus is to bring together the kind of academic excellence that institutions like Cornell, like the Technion, like a number of other leading institutions in the world are known for, to bring that kind of academic leadership together with a spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship. And in fact, this question that a couple of the panelists have raised so far about just the nature of long-term research and creativity versus sort of invention and innovation and things that are having an impact in the world, our goal is to bridge that sort of gap, the gap between the long-term and the initially creative work and the work that really has an impact out there in the world. And that's something that we see in the kinds of students that we're attracting and the kinds of faculty that we're attracting, really building a new culture. We have this opportunity with a new campus to create a new academic culture where there's equal respect for both the societal and commercial impact of work and for the academic far-reaching kind of leadership. So with that sort of backdrop of what Cornell Tech is doing, I wanted to just comment on a couple of things that we see in terms of changes in the high-tech innovation sort of arena. So one change that we see happening, and again, I'll say that for the moment, I see this particularly in the high-tech sector, although I believe it's also happening in innovation elsewhere. Conventionally, there's this view of the innovation process as starting with basic research, and there being sort of a pipeline or funnel model over time where basic research then becomes advanced development, then becomes product development, then gets out into the marketplace. And depending on the industry, that sort of technology pipeline can often take a number of years. One of the things that we see that's happening is that instead of that sequential sort of pipeline model, at least in the high-tech arena, you're starting to see the basic fundamental research and the product development, things that were at opposite ends of that pipeline, happening simultaneously rather than sequentially. And so specific examples of that are if you look at Google's search algorithms, if you look at Microsoft's Kinect device, if you look at Facebook's social graph, these are all innovations that are affecting our daily lives in the commercial world, and yet they're also innovations where the fundamental research is really happening in parallel with the technology innovation rather than sequentially. So we believe that that calls for a new type of university endeavor, a new type of university campus. In fact, not surprisingly, the kind of campus that we're building here in New York, where we're bringing together academic leadership with innovative companies, having companies on the campus, in fact, having representatives from the Patent and Trademark Office on the campus. So the US...
I should have mentioned, since October, we sent someone from the USPTO to actually be on site at Cornell NYC Tech to actually support them and to ride along with them on this marvelous endeavor.
And so we see this really as a global kind of change where the nature of technology innovation is changing. It's not something that's just particular to our campus or just to New York City, although we believe that New York City is an ideal place to be doing this. The second thing, in addition to this sort of change from a sequential to more parallel innovation models in the tech sector that we see that's related, is the increase in what's known as iterative technology development. And again, this is something where in the high-tech sector it's been happening the fastest, where you get customers engaged very, very early on in the development process, and you iterate the product development very rapidly. When you look at software as a service kinds of models, that's a place where this sort of iterative product development is most easily done. And so that's why we think in the software arena you're seeing this probably more than you are in other sectors. But this is another thing that we think is a big shift in the technology innovation ecosystem. And again, something where we believe that stronger ties between the academic world and the commercial world will really benefit all of us. So we're really excited to be here in New York City. We view New York as a place with so many information-rich industries, so many things that can be are being transformed and continue to be transformed by the development of information and digital technologies, that we view this as a really ideal place to be engaging in this new kind of endeavor.
Thank you, Dan. And I must say that from Johnson's perspective, we're also very happy to be helping along the project, because really it's a way in which engineering, sciences, computer science, and business comes together to help create the kind of entrepreneurial innovation we are seeking in New York City. So last but not least, I hand the mic to Barry.
Thank you very much, Soumitra. And I mean, this has been a real privilege for us over the last few years to support the index, so we hope to continue that collaboration over the years to come. I'm just going to make a couple remarks so we can get to the Q&A and broader discussion, echoing, I think, some of the comments that have already been made. Booz, we come to this, from the corporate perspective. Personally, from 25 years of working with clients around innovation, R&D, and product development kinds of issues. And I think the first thing is I would have to share is I think innovation is probably one of the most overused words out there. You ask, you get 5 people together and ask them the definition of innovation, you'll get 7 to 12 definitions of it. I tend to harken back to I think the old Bell Labs mantra that an innovation wasn't really an innovation and actually helped you do something, solve a problem, out in the field, in their case, out in the network of the Ma Bell back in the day. So innovation is not just science. Science and research and development are a critical foundational element, but it's just one element of actually doing something that changes how people live or work or how something is made. Clearly one of the I think major things that this group and this assemblage is really interested in is how innovation can play a role in economic development. I think a major aspect of that is the potential for innovation hubs where there is collaboration between industry, academia, government, and the financial community to actually create self-reinforcing things that are rooted in science and research, but actually create economic progress. Clearly Silicon Valley is the global poster child for these kinds of achievements, but they're much more common than some of us realize. There's things for many years in optics in upstate New York between the things that came out of Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, University of Rochester. And there's things around the world where people have focused and found a hub around something they know. And the few things I would just share with you is our work with corporations has really identified that there are several things. It's not all about funding. It's about like how you use that money, around the talent you develop, around portfolio management, where you pick your bets of where you're going to invest your resources and focus your R&D talent, rigorous processes around managing the product development process, something that's repeatable and transparent, and having a strategy and culture that's aligned with what your business objectives are. And this is one of always the challenges between industry and the public sector of really finding things that are both aligned mutually. We're both achieving our own objectives, not something that's just simply for the public good. Corporations have their objectives, and finding those points of common alignment are critical and sometimes hard, but when they do, they can be self-reinforcing and fairly powerful. I mean, the last couple comments I would just make is the things we've found that are the biggest differentiators for corporations in terms of actual performance is one around this alignment of innovation objectives with corporate strategy objectives, but also the level of end user insight. That doesn't necessarily mean the direct customer you're selling. Companies that have developed superior understanding of the end user of what they're making typically are the most successful. And research we've done with the Bay Area Council around what makes Silicon Valley different is there's distinct cultural elements that would be familiar to many people around what you think constitutes a startup kind of mentality. But the other largest difference between your average Bay Area company and your average major corporation around the world is the level of end user insight they've done to guide their development efforts, to figure out what makes sense to go forward with and what makes sense to stop, from a development activity. And those are really big swingers in terms of performance. And my kind of closing comment would be kind of what's the role of the public sector and government? Not to sort of weigh into things that tend to get political, but clearly providing a talent pool, an educated workforce that is scientifically literate and scientifically skilled, that industry can reach into, is critical. Having a long-term commitment to science, so there's a pool of technology that organizations and corporations can leverage based on when they see a need, and not necessarily have to take the risk of something that maybe 20, 30, even 40 years down the road before it actually has economic benefit that a corporation could potentially benefit from. And I think the last piece is, which many people have been alluding to, is the protection of intellectual property that allows people to benefit from the investments they've made. But I think I'm echoing many of the other points. But with that, I will turn it over to Soumitra and broader discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barry, and thanks to Bruce for your support of the project. Thank you very much. Now, we would like to involve you in the discussion. So I'm sure you have been stimulated by these different perspectives in innovation, different viewpoints, bringing different sort of dimensions to the debate. And I'd like you to just raise your hand. We'll have this microphone that will circulate. We'll pick up maybe 4 or 5 questions and then get the panel to respond to the questions together. So,
yeah, please. I noticed on one of the slides, the U.S. was number 3 in inputs, but wasn't in the top 10 in outputs from your index. And is that a problem in terms of efficiency or what's going on in this country?
some more questions?
Soumitra?
Yes,
Just a quick follow-up to that first question. I noticed in one of the tables that the United States ranked not so well in terms of high-tech and other innovative exports. And I'm wondering, is that a reflection on what is produced here, or a reflection on concern about protecting intellectual property rights in other countries?
Hi, I had a related question. It's often hard to get statistics and to evaluate those statistics. It's a monumental task, and I congratulate the team who put that together in this report. But is there some way, and it may be described in the report, and I haven't read it yet, what your methodology was in order to rank and get the information to do the ranking? So I remember in the UN system, I used to work there years ago, that was one of the things we did, is help try to get statistics. But what was, if you could describe briefly, if not, just to raise the question.
You mentioned the quality of the outputs, and I'd be interested to see what else is behind that. I saw the footnote with citations in other journals. How much of that is effective marketing versus, some other, clear, objective measurements?
Okay, I see a lot of questions around the model so far, okay?
Thank you very much. Product life cycle in the process of innovation and the need to bridge the time gap to meet the urgency of the need of those products on the market. Climate change, for instance, is an issue. We need new technologies to change the patterns immediately. How do we relate that to the pricing and the concept of product life cycle? I know you know it, how it goes. Yes, thank you.
Can we get a few questions in the back? So just to make sure we're getting some.
Good morning. I have a quick question. We spent so much time talking about understanding different international cultures and respecting different international governments. Could we talk a little bit about bridging those gaps in terms of intellectual property?
Okay, maybe some at the back. And then we'll go through one round of answers, and then we'll come back to some more questions.
Most of the speakers talked about the baseline or pillars for innovation and talked about it in a very structured way. Can innovation come out of chaos? And specifically, what could any of the panel members see coming out of the Arab Spring?
So let's just take a few minutes to answer some of these questions, and then we'll do another round of questions in a few minutes. So as many questions were focused on the Innovation Index report and the methodology, let me just briefly answer them, and I'd like to request you to look at the report in more details for the actual finer details. So there is that overall model, and we evaluate the different components of the model with the help of 84 indicators. The 84 indicators are taken from mainly international public sources like the World Bank. Some of them are taken from private sources. For example, the YouTube data is taken from Google, so they have been collaborating with us in some cases. And only 5 of the 84 indicators are based on subjective viewpoints. So those are coming from a subjective executive opinion survey run by the World Economic Forum, in which they survey the top executives in the country and ask them their views on different things. So it's subjective opinion across different, let's say, countries on some issues. So we take 5 of the 84 are subjective, and the rest are all really so-called hard data. Some of them are index variables themselves, but at the same time, by and large, the bulk of it is hard data. So when you go and look at a specific value for a specific country, there is a lot of information about where the data source is. And of course, depending on the data source itself has some limitations, or the explanation is there for why some country performs better or worse in some area. Now, in terms of the specific questions you asked about U.S. high-tech exports, and your question is about...
My question was that our output looks much lower.
Right, about outputs and inputs and indicator. That's an area how you can engage in having a discussion. So if, for example, the U.S. efficiency ratio is lower than expected, one question which can be debated in a policy setting is, why is it so? First of all, is it accurate? Second of all, if it's accurate, what are the messages for us as a country? And more important, what kind of corrective actions can we perhaps encourage? So I think that's really the kind of data and the indicators that can lead to some kind of productive discussions. So the data is what it is. There's very little subjective element out there. Most of it is hard data. And you can, of course, use some combination of the information that is most relevant for your own context. But typically for a large country like the US, it's often hard to match that same kind of efficiency ratios. For smaller countries, typically it's easier because it's much more smaller and you can have more uniform results across the country. So in that sense, I must say that the US results in coming even fifth is remarkable, and it's a big credit to the country and its many strengths. Maybe someone wants to take the address of the product life cycles.
Thank you. I'm not sure I totally understood the product life cycle aspect. I can analogize it a little bit to pharmaceuticals, where product life cycles, we give intellectual property when a patent is first, when a new molecule or a new chemical or a new drug is first created, and then that morphs into different types of products that are better for patients. And my best analogy there is that if you come up with a medication that requires administration to a patient 2 to 4 times a day, and if you can come up with a version that I could take once a week, once a month, or every year, as we have right now with osteoporosis drugs, for instance, to me that's good, and I would like that product life cycle innovation to continue to be developed. And from the perspective of the US Patent and Trademark Office, we will continue to provide patent protection, if appropriate, for those innovations for that product life cycle. Environmentally, that is analogous. I'm just not that familiar with that particular industry. But efficiencies with environmental quality, with using our precious resources here, capturing resources from the sun or from the wind, even incremental improvements, I would like to see, because those tiny changes oftentimes bring out very good, very big results. And in this country, the United States continues to provide patent protection to encourage that innovation. And I always like to analogize there to the light bulb from Thomas Edison. There was actually 3 parties who actually were working on the filament for a light bulb, trying to come up with something that would glow and not self-destruct very rapidly. So the filament from a light bulb. So while Thomas Edison, we all think of him as being first, the reason we think of him as being first is because there was a proceeding in the US Patent and Trademark Office where the 3 parties said who actually invented it first. And there was an interference proceeding, a trial within the patent office, and Thomas Edison won, and then you had Edison Electric, and the rest is history. But the light bulb, for as revolutionary as that was an incremental innovation. That was not a huge new disruptive innovation. So incremental innovations and product life cycle improvements are something that I personally would like to see. It will improve my quality of life. It may allow me to live longer, and I want to stay as good looking as possible too. So I'll take as many improvements as we can come up with, no matter what value anybody wants to put on them. I'm not sure if I addressed the question. Thanks.
Anyone else wants to address some of the questions raised here, Bob?
Yeah, I like that notion of the light bulb being an incremental thing, because the cartoons always show it as the sort of the instantaneous generation of idea, iconicized by the light bulb. It's sort of like the idea of going from the frying pan into the fire in incremental stages. I wanted to make 2 comments. One about methodology, which I think ultimately is critical to the way you interpret any of the numbers in that report. I mean, if you think about a faculty member who writes 1 seminal paper, and it says at the end, it's not escaped us that this might have something to do with human evolution, like the DNA paper of Watson and Crick, or another faculty member who has 1 idea really, but splays it out into 100 different papers. I mean, if the metric is how many papers, then you're going to get radically different answers to those 2 things. Same thing is true in patents. They can be divided and subdivided and the like. And I think you can look at innovations in terms of direct impact on GDP, and you can look at them also in terms of what did it prevent. I mean, somebody came up with a really neat way of getting rid of hurricanes. I mean, Bill Gates had this idea about taking cold water, feeding it into something to kind of get rid of them. That's probably not something that you license and sell, because it's not a consumer product exactly. Maybe governments would pay for it, but it's not clear whose responsibility it is. But there are There are those kinds of investments that really boost GDP and improvement, and those investments that really are defensive in one sense or another. And finally, I wanted to get back to, this wasn't one of the questions, but it was kind of a remark that I think you made, Terry, about the basic versus more directed research. I commented about what DARPA had done, because DARPA had a particular mission. Everything had to be tied into a defense need. The reason DARPA was so successful, I believe, is because we had other mechanisms within the federal government for supporting the basic research you're talking about. The National Science Foundation often does what you're talking about. There are certain agencies in defense that get much more into the experimental basic stuff ahead of time, what they call the OXRs, Office of Naval Research, Army Research, and the like. And so it's just a matter of distinguishing between the needs of a place that has to tie it directly. You didn't want to get the Proxmire Award every year for just doing basic research that wasn't tied to the mission of the agency. So that's really important to keep a healthy system in place. You need a balance between those places that take their money and focus it, and those places that take their money and essentially put an escape valve on the rest of the research community's pent-up interests.
I heard one question related to the Arab Spring, and I didn't know exactly the angle, but it gives me a chance to say two things that I think are relevant. The data that's been shown is a huge effort to define international innovation. And I think there's two aspects of what's happening, not just in the Arab world, but around the world right now, that I think are relevant. One is the inequalities that we face. Being a physician, one of the most difficult and discouraging things in a worldwide medical view is the unbelievable inequalities, culture to culture and country to country, and even within this country, one country, inequalities of access to medical care has such an effect on every opportunity in a person's life. But Soumitra, the wonderful data that you've gathered over these years shows other areas of inequalities that we could think about, sort of a political statement that your data shows us areas in which the U.S. and other countries who are high on the resource part of the curve could help invest, because I personally believe all the ships will rise if all the ships will rise. And the other thing which is a political statement, is I really hope that we can stay the course in this country on comprehensive immigration reform, because the subtext of this entire area is that ideas know no national boundaries. That's especially true because of innovations like the internet, but people themselves still are stuck behind boundaries, going in multiple directions. As a first-generation American, I've experienced a little tiny bit of it in my family, not personally. And as president of Cornell, where 20% of our students are international students, and the graduate disciplines almost 50%, it makes a huge difference in that talent generation. And then finally, I just want to take a second also to recognize our colleagues in the USPTO. I called Dan the day that your predecessor called me, and I said, Dan, why is the Department of Commerce calling me? And he said, I'm sure you did something wrong.
One comment I would just make is, I think people have been alluding to it, but when we get into this space of innovation and R&D, is that we can't sort of underestimate the importance of serendipity. That one of the reasons for the necessity of a commitment to science as a foundation is it is very hard, to anticipate what a scientific discovery will actually allow you to do. I'm sure that Bob and his colleagues 30 years ago did not anticipate Facebook and the ways that the internet would be used, and the various things that were created. And it's that inability to anticipate, none of us are clairvoyant, is critical, and have to have almost a faith-based approach to that. Science is necessary to create a foundation, and people will figure out how to apply it. I spend most of my time in the corporate arena, and one of the inputs we shared with Soumitra is the work we do looking at the 1,000 largest corporate spenders in terms of R&D. Last year, those companies spent about $600 billion of R&D, which is about 48% of all the R&D spending, public sector, private sector, on the planet. But only maybe 15% of that would be anything you would qualify as the R in R&D. It's all applied development, figuring out how to solve, customers' problems. So, it is critical that academia and government provide that foundation, that sort of toolkit and shop shelf of things you can reach into that industry can then apply to solve customers' problems, whether they be huge leaps forward or small incremental improvements, because most of that's what it is. It's small incremental improvements on existing ideas. But the cumulative effect of those over decades is economic progress.
Thank you, Soumitra. May I take up the question that was asked about the differences in attitude to intellectual property on the part of some of the developing countries and the attitudes that prevail in much of the developed world? Yes, indeed. I mean, this is a reality. This is a reality. We can't deny it. It's a reality really which comes out of a different period, I must say. It comes out of much of the thinking that went on 40, nearly 50 years ago in the 1970s, and by the way, we are as far from the 1970s as the 1970s were from the 1930s. And I think that if you had thought in the 1970s that you would base, any action upon an analysis of the world as it was in the 1930s, well, you would say that this was crazy. But nevertheless, we do have these lingering attitudes that prevail now. And let us face it, I mean, the basis of this difference, I think, is the very different capacities that exist to be able to generate innovation between, on the one hand, the developing world and the developed world. However, that said, human talent is the same all across the world. So it is a question, we believe, of creating the right institutional conditions to allow that human talent to flourish. And that is, again, to repeat myself if I may, why we believe that the Global Innovation Index is a very good thing. It's a work in progress, but it's trying to set out a blueprint for what are the circumstances that do allow human talent to flourish. And in all of that, we believe that intellectual property is not a lock, it's an enabler. It's one of the conditions that is necessary in order to be able to help, if you're looking in the area of science or technology, if you like, to help an idea on its way on the long march, to eventually appearing as a commercialized product or service, as the case may be, or it's one of the conditions that is necessary to unleash the extraordinary talent that exists, for example, in terms of performance and arts and music and in the cultural areas in the developing world, which does not find sufficient outlets in global markets. So those are a few words. It's a very complex subject, obviously, however.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have time for 2 or 3 questions additional. So maybe one question out here, this table. Yeah, I see a hand out here also.
The question I have is about infrastructure. I'll come back to the electric light. Okay, that was an innovation, but in order for it to be a success, you had to have power generation and power distribution as well. The 3 of them enabled an infrastructure then that other things were able to innovate and plug into. And so just some thoughts that you might have on infrastructure.
Let's take 2 questions out there. We'll come back to you, sir.
I'm from the Intangibles program of the Conference Board, and we spend a lot of time measuring innovation. So my question is more technical. I read all the components of your index, and I noticed that there is no measurement of design. And design is an important part of product development. And also, in product development, you usually have market research before you develop a product. I think that part is not here. And another thing, is advertisement. I see that you have trademarks. Advertisement, I think in terms of spending, you can develop new products under the same trademark. And usually you would spend some money for advertisement. So I'm thinking that all those three components, internationally like advertisement and market research, those data are available for international comparison. And for design, you can connect data country by country. But I think this is a good work on the global index. We do need a macro measurement of innovation. Thank you.
I saw a hand behind out there. I think anyone else behind you?
This is a question related more to the difference between the 1970s and current. I came here as a graduate student in 1970, having graduated from India's one of the top technical universities called IIT. In our days, roughly 70% of our graduating class used to come to the US. And the current statistics are that less than 5% of the graduating classes from, say, IIT Bombay, which I belong to, come here. That has a huge impact in terms of innovation. There used to be about 3 PhDs awarded at IIT Bombay in 1970. Currently, they award around 200 PhDs a year. So are we losing out in the innovation race here in the US?
Okay, I'll just take one more question out here, Ankur, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. So
thank you. Are you connected here?
Connected.
Okay. So I'll stand up. How does job creation factor into the index, and should it be a more important factor, perhaps as one of the outputs? What I'm getting at is that no country is interested in innovation just for the sake of innovation. They want it to be a driver for the creation of good, sustainable jobs. Yet, Teresa, just as one example, you mentioned self-driving cars, which is incredibly innovative. Yet, as I see it, that's probably something that creates a few jobs, but eliminates many more jobs than it potentially creates. So, what is the goal here of innovation in a country as they're planning their economies? If it is to not just introduce the technology into that country, that's going to be a global thing, but to create jobs internally, I don't see really, from as I go through very quickly, how that factors in. Okay, thank you.
Ankur, is another question? One last question out there, and then we have to close here.
Thank you. I was a Cornell College Scholar in the Sciences, and I'm the executive director of a company in New York City that provides science, technology, and engineering education in the New York City public and charter schools. And about 90% of our schools arrive to us and confess that they do not teach any science at the K-5 level. And many of our students arrive to middle school and high school with an incredible dearth of science and engineering education. So my question is, how do any of the panelists see the relationship between K-12 education, particularly here in New York City, as regards the new Cornell Tech campus, and higher education?
Okay, I have 2 more questions and 1 suggestion. I also have the research group in China about the innovation index. And according to our research, that United States should be the #1 in innovation for at least the recent more than 10 years. So according to our index, for the recent, I have not only read that this year, but some other years. And also according to some the innovation index about Bloomberg, that the United States doesn't list as the top 1. So what's the reason? That's the one question. The second question is that almost all the indicators that they based on the 1 year's the input result. As we know that for the innovation, that should be the long term, and the investment will be effective maybe that more than 5 or 10 years. So we have the position that changed very fast that each year. So maybe that we should find some way that to input to calculate the input for the several, maybe that more than 5 years or 10 years, it will be more stable. Yes, and the suggestion is that so there are so many the innovation index here right now. It's possible that we also the public the combination index based on the several the innovation index. Maybe that's only a suggestion. Anyway, they have done the very excellent work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I fully realize that we are at the end of the time that was set for this agenda. So I would like to request the panel members to give very short reactions to what they have heard. Perhaps Dan, do you want to go first?
So I can't, it's going to be hard for me to go short on the topic of K through 12 education, but I'll try. So you know, I think that this is both a US and a global issue. I'll focus for a moment on the US piece. I mean, in the United States right now, we see sort of repeated stages in the educational system where children are essentially steered away from gaining further education in mathematics, sciences, and technology. I don't think there's any way to put it other than being steered away from, frankly. This is something that we've been really looking at what can a graduate level institution and what should a graduate level institution be doing here in New York City in this regard, but I think it's a big national challenge that many have been working on. Our particular focus right now actually is middle school, so we're not going back as far as the K through 5 piece, but we're also not starting in the high schools where we view there as being quite a lot of programs at the moment. I actually don't see that question as that unrelated to the issue that the gentleman back there raised about immigration to the United States. And in particular India and the IITs, which being a computer scientist and engineer myself are institutions I know quite well. I think that when you look back to the 1970s, the United States was clearly the place to be coming as somebody who was highly trained in computer science, engineering type disciplines. That's less true now, and I actually think that's good for the world. But the thing that I think is a problem globally is the integration of a technology education with understanding of things beyond and outside of technology. I think it's a challenge here as we look at how do we try to reform what's commonly called STEM education in K through 12. Many of the ways that these things are taught about science specifically and less tied to things that make a difference to people who aren't intrinsically interested in science is a problem. And I see that as something that's not just a US problem, but actually the Indian higher education system, I think, suffers from many of the same issues. So I see there really being a global problem here that we all need to address of how do we integrate the education around science and technology for our youth of today with the challenges and problems that people see outside of the technology sector.
Anyone else would like to make a comment on any of the issues raised?
No. Just a gently contrarian point of view on the science education. And I'm a doc, I'm a scientist. All our problems are not going to be solved by science alone. And in medical world, if we don't think about cultures and ethics, the best science will not cross over. There's cultures that won't accept vaccination. There's many people who are concerned about GMOs. And there's cultures in which other scientific advances don't cross cultural barriers. So I do worry, even though my education was in the sciences, I do worry that in our very understandable rush at a time still of a worldwide recession towards STEM education, that we'll walk too quickly away from liberal arts. People say that a lot and have said it for decades, but I think we're really at a risk now of walking away from liberal arts disciplines, especially in the K through 12 system, where it's relatively easy to cut programs in the arts and humanities because of lack of champions for those programs. So I don't know of another federal agency, Terry will correct me, that's had cuts as deep as the NEH and NEA over years. And I think it's because of lack of political pushback. So just a slightly contrarian attitude. Of course, officially, I agree with everything Dean Huttenlocher said.
I want to See, I'm particularly interested in these infrastructure issues, so let me address that particular question that was raised this first part of this latest round of questions. We actually have produced a series of monographs on how infrastructure is created. They're available on the net. We created a whole bunch of them and just mailed them out for free, and now we get requests, usually from universities who want to use them for training and infrastructure development. But the first one was how the railroads were created, the second one how telephones and telegraphs were created, the third one on power and lighting, the fourth one was on the banking industry, how that was created. It was one of the first that actually wasn't a high-tech kind of thing, depending on a lot of personal interaction. And the fifth was on radio and content, going back to Maxwell and Hertz and going up to the FCC in 1934. The thing about infrastructure is that it is an enabler, lowers the barrier for use of all kinds of products and applications. And the critical part about it is that there's a chicken and egg problem. You know, without the infrastructure, people don't create the applications and the products, and without the products, there's no market for the infrastructure. So it's a challenge in every one of those cases, and it's usually been the federal government that's played the role in breaking the logjam, but not always. So for example, in the case of the railroads, you have this incredible land grant phenomenon where along the rights of way of the railroads, the federal government would grant rights to somebody for, you know, half a mile or a mile, and then the federal government would keep it for the next half a mile, and by doing that they try to enable interest in people to build up capabilities along the way. In the case of the electricity grid, one of the things I found so interesting was they couldn't easily find a way to get that going, and it turned out to be public safety that created the first infrastructure where they would replace some of the gas lights with electrical outdoor lighting in some places. And it was, again, a federal kind of investment that caused this to happen, and it kind of grew organically from there. So one of the most interesting questions in infrastructure is how do you break that chicken and egg syndrome? Where are the motivating applications? I don't think in the banking industry it was so much the federal government, but it took a lot of other things to make that work on a national scale.
Thank you so much, and I would like to unfortunately draw this session to a close. I would like to, of course, please join me in thanking our panel members. I really agree with you that they have been just simply outstanding. I'd also like to thank you because you have given us your time, and time is the most precious commodity that we have right now, the most precious resource. So thank you very much for your time. This is just yet another step in this journey to better understand innovation, to help drive innovation in our own economies. And clearly the measure of success of any such meeting like this is what kind of ideas and what kind of questions that you are leaving the meeting with. And I certainly hope that you found some answers, but I certainly hope the questions you're leaving with are more than the questions you came with initially. Because the secret of leadership is the ability to ask the right question and not necessarily always having the right answers. So asking the right question is the key, and I encourage you to carry on the journey for innovation in your own ways, in your own environments. Thank you very much. And I'd like to remind our media colleagues that there is a special group for the media on the 5th floor. So the media colleagues, please.